What happens when a young, ambitious journalist challenges a Hollywood legend? At a star-studded gala, Brandon Keller set out to humiliate Clint Eastwood, only to walk away with a lesson he never expected. What unfolded next would leave him questioning everything he thought he knew about fame, wisdom, and true strength. The Beverly Wilshire Hotel glittered like a jewel under the soft glow of chandeliers, their reflections dancing across the gold-trimmed walls. The ballroom was a sea of designer gowns and tailored suits, swirling through an evening of whispered alliances and carefully measured laughter. Glasses clinked, backs were patted, and beneath the polished surface, ambition simmered like a fire just waiting for air. Officially, this was a gala to support veterans' mental health, a noble cause. Unofficially, it was another Hollywood performance, one where sincerity was optional, but appearances were everything. Industry titans and rising stars mingled with practiced ease, each interaction another step in the endless waltz of influence. The scent of aged whiskey mixed with expensive cologne, and the tension in the air was just thick enough to be felt. Some were here out of genuine support. Others? They were here for the cameras, the handshakes, the chance to be seen standing for something, even if their convictions were as fleeting as the ice melting in their cocktails. Then, like a shift in the tide, the room hushed. Conversation stuttered mid-sentence, heads subtly turning toward the entrance. Clint Eastwood had arrived. No entourage, no grand announcement. Just a man in a sharp black suit, hands in his pockets, moving through the room like a ghost from another era. He didn't need an introduction, he was presence itself. And across the ballroom, a young journalist named Brandon Keller watched, sensing an opportunity. A moment to seize, a legend to challenge. Brandon Keller adjusted his tie, feeling the smooth fabric between his fingers. He had been waiting for this, watching, calculating. His phone was already set to record, hidden in his pocket, ready to capture a moment that would rocket his name across social media. He wasn't a household name, not yet. But in the world of political commentary, he was rising fast, carving a niche as a fearless critic of outdated Hollywood icons. Tonight, he saw his golden opportunity. Clint Eastwood was a relic, a symbol of a bygone era. To Keller, the industry had moved past men like him, actors who embodied a version of masculinity that no longer fit the modern narrative. And yet, here Eastwood was, walking into the gala like he still belonged. Keller smirked. He was going to make sure the world saw otherwise. With an air of confidence bordering on arrogance, he weaved through the crowd, past murmuring guests and half-empty champagne flutes. He could already imagine the headline. Clint Eastwood finally called out. Watch him stumble over his own ignorance. The thought thrilled him. He wasn't here for conversation, he was here for a takedown. A viral moment. Eastwood was near the bar now, deep in conversation with an old war veteran. He hadn't noticed Keller yet. Perfect. Taking a breath, Keller straightened his posture, stepped forward, and cleared his throat. "Mr. Eastwood," he said, loud enough for people to hear. "Brandon Keller, the Sentinel Review. Mind if I ask you a few questions?" The moment Keller spoke, a ripple went through the nearby guests. Conversations quieted, eyes flicking toward the bar. Some turned fully, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Even the bartender mid-pour hesitated for half a second. Clint Eastwood barely acknowledged him. He remained focused on the veteran he'd been speaking with, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable. Keller didn't like that. He had expected an immediate reaction, maybe a flicker of annoyance, a subtle sign of discomfort. Instead, Eastwood treated him like background noise, an afterthought. That only fueled Keller's determination. He took a step closer, his voice deliberately friendly but edged with something sharper. "I'll make it quick," he assured, flashing a tight-lipped smile. "I just wanted to get your thoughts on Hollywood's changing landscape." At that, Eastwood finally turned, his piercing gaze settling on the young journalist. "You've been in the industry for over 60 years," Keller continued. "Do you think people like you still have a place in it?" There it was. The setup. The words "people like you" hung in the air, heavy with implication. A few guests exchanged glances. Someone set their glass down a little too loudly. Keller could feel it. the perfect storm brewing. This was the moment that would define the night. He had Clint Eastwood on camera in front of an audience. All he needed now was for the old cowboy to stumble, to give him the soundbite he wanted. But Clint Eastwood didn't stumble. He just stared. And then he sighed. Eastwood's sigh wasn't one of frustration or anger. It was the kind of sigh a man gives when faced with something so predictable, so unimpressive, that it barely warrants a response. He reached for his drink, took a slow sip, and set the glass down with deliberate ease. Only then did he speak. "You rehearsed that one, didn't you?" A low chuckle rippled through the crowd, soft but unmistakable. Keller's jaw tightened. He hadn't expected that. He was supposed to be the one controlling the narrative. He forced a smirk. "I'm just asking the questions people want answers to." Eastwood tilted his head slightly as if considering something. "People," he repeated, letting the word roll off his tongue. "Or just you?" The subtle challenge sent another murmur through the onlookers. Keller hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. He wasn't following the script in his head anymore. Eastwood leaned forward, resting an elbow on the bar. "You think the world moves forward just because some guy with a keyboard says so?" His voice was steady, unshaken. "Real change doesn't come from tearing things down. It comes from building something better." Keller opened his mouth, searching for a retort, but Eastwood wasn't finished. "You don't erase the past just because you don't like it, kid." He took another sip of his drink. "You learned from it." This time, the chuckle from the crowd was louder. Someone clapped. Keller felt it now, the first crack in his confidence. Keller's smirk faltered, but he forced himself to push forward. He had to regain control. "With all due respect, Mr. Eastwood," he said, his voice a little tighter, "it's easy for you to talk about learning from the past when your generation had it easier." A murmur ran through the room, this time not in Keller's favor. A few guests exchanged unimpressed glances. The air had shifted. Eastwood let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Easier?" he repeated, like he had just heard the dumbest thing all night. "I started in Hollywood when they told actors like me to change their names because they sounded too rough," he said. "I laid bricks before I ever stepped in front of a camera." "You think that was easy?" Keller blinked. He hadn't expected that answer. He scrambled for something, anything, to turn the conversation back in his favor. But Eastwood wasn't done. He took another slow sip of his drink. "I've seen guys like you before," he said, looking for a soundbite, hoping to make a scene. "But here's the thing." He set his glass down, locking eyes with Keller. "You walked in here thinking I'd fold, that I'd get mad, stumble over my words, maybe even storm off." He shrugged. "But I don't do performances on command. That's your job." The room erupted in laughter. A couple of guests even clapped. Keller felt his stomach sink. This wasn't the way it was supposed to go. Keller's confidence was cracking, but he refused to show it. He straightened his posture, forcing a smirk. He still had a chance to turn this around. "All right," he said, trying to sound unfazed. "So maybe you had some struggles. But don't you think there's a reason people your age are being left behind in Hollywood? Maybe audiences don't want outdated ideas shoved down their throats anymore." Eastwood chuckled, not with amusement, but with something closer to disappointment. He shook his head. "Left behind?" he repeated. "Son, I've outlived entire Hollywood trends. Been written off more times than I can count. And yet, here I am." He gestured around the room. "And here you are, at my event, using my name to try and make a headline." The words landed hard. Keller's smirk wavered. He opened his mouth, searching for a response, but nothing came. Someone in the crowd muttered, "Damn." A few guests exchanged knowing looks. The energy had shifted completely. Keller felt it now, that creeping awareness that he had lost control of the moment. He wasn't dismantling a Hollywood relic. He was standing in front of a man who had seen it all, survived it all, and wasn't the least bit rattled by some ambitious journalist looking for a viral clip. For the first time that night, Keller hesitated. And that hesitation was all Eastwood needed to seal his fate. Keller's mind raced, but his mouth was dry. He had no comeback. His entire narrative was crumbling in front of him, and there was nothing he could do to salvage it. He shifted uncomfortably, trying to regain his footing. I just think people deserve better, he muttered. Better stories, better representation, better. Eastwood cut him off with a slow, knowing nod. So tell him, he said. You keep talking about what people don't want. Go ahead. Tell him what they do want. Keller blinked. What? Eastwood leaned back, eyes unwavering. Right now. Say something that matters more than the movies I've made, the people I've worked with, or the history I've been a part of. The words hit Keller like a punch to the gut. He had no answer, nothing worth saying. The silence between them stretched, heavy and suffocating. The crowd waited, but Keller was paralyzed. His mind raced, but all he could come up with was noise, empty words that didn't mean anything. Eastwood gave a slight shrug. Thought so, he said, picking up his drink again. The crowd's laughter echoed in Keller's ears, but this time it wasn't just amusement, it was finality. He had lost. Keller stood there, stunned as the reality of the moment hit him full force. The audience wasn't on his side anymore. They weren't nodding along, waiting for him to bring Eastwood down. They were watching him squirm, some amused, others pitiful. He could feel the heat of humiliation creeping up his neck, turning his face red. Every part of him wanted to escape, but he couldn't just walk away. Or could he? Keller opened his mouth to say something, but the words wouldn't come. His earlier bravado had evaporated, leaving him exposed. Without another word, he turned on his heel and disappeared into the crowd. No clever exit. No last remarks. Just a man who had overestimated himself and lost spectacularly. The room buzzed with conversations, but Keller's failed confrontation still hung in the air like a bad taste nobody could shake off. He was just another name now, added to a long list of those who had underestimated Clint Eastwood. Across the room, Eastwood didn't watch him go. He simply took another sip of his drink, his expression unreadable before returning to his conversation. He didn't need to prove anything. And Keller? He had just learned a hard lesson about wisdom versus arrogance. The gala continued without skipping a beat, the clinking of champagne glasses and hushed conversations filling the air once again. But for Keller, the world had changed. He slipped through the crowd, avoiding eye contact with anyone who might have witnessed his public downfall. The weight of his humiliation was unbearable, but there was no way to hide it. A middle-aged producer standing near the bar chuckled as he shook his head. You didn't have to do him like that, he said to Eastwood, who was still quietly sipping his drink. Eastwood raised an eyebrow. I didn't do anything. The producer smirked knowingly. Come on, you let that kid walk right into a buzzsaw. Eastwood cracked a small grin, his eyes still sharp. He walked into it himself. I just didn't move it out of the way. The producer laughed, shaking his head. You know they'll twist this, right? Make you out to be the bad guy. Eastwood shrugged nonchalantly. They've been doing that for years. Doesn't change the truth. Over by the corner, another guest leaned toward their companion and muttered, Man, these people really think they can out-talk Clint Eastwood. The friend chuckled. They keep trying. But every time the outcome's the same. Keller's pride had been shattered, but the crowd had already moved on. Eastwood wasn't the villain here. Keller was. And as the night wore on, Keller became a footnote in a story that wasn't his to tell. As the evening wore on, Keller's presence at the gala felt more like an afterthought than a pivotal moment. He had come to make his mark, to challenge a legend, but now he was just another man who had failed spectacularly in front of an audience. His name would likely trend for a few hours, but the lasting impact would belong to Eastwood, as it always had. The night continued in its usual glamorous rhythm. Whispers of deals, soft laughter, the murmur of Hollywood's elite, and Keller was an invisible part of the scenery. But the lesson, the real one, wasn't lost on him. It wasn't just about politics, fame, or who was right. It was about the wisdom that comes from experience, the kind that Eastwood had acquired over decades of hard work, rejection, and success. Eastwood had never needed a shout to make his presence known. He had let time and his actions speak for themselves. Keller had been loud, confident, and eager to tear something down, but he had failed to build anything of substance. In the end, it wasn't about silencing the old guard, it was about earning the right to be heard. As Keller slipped out of the gala, humiliated but wiser, He couldn't help but feel a shift inside him. He had learned something that night, a lesson Eastwood didn't need to teach him. He had to find his own voice, not by knocking others down, but by learning to stand tall just as Clint Eastwood had done for so many years. As Keller walked into the cool night air, he felt the weight of his own arrogance pressing down on him. The city's lights flickered in the distance, but the glow felt distant, almost hollow. His phone buzzed, a few notifications from his followers, but none of it mattered. The viral moment he'd imagined was slipping through his fingers. He had come to challenge a legend, to prove a point, but he had only exposed his own shortcomings. The viral headlines wouldn't be the ones he had planned. They would be the ones reminding everyone of his failure. And yet, in the quiet of the night, Keller knew something had changed inside him. He had lost the battle, but there was a lesson in that loss. It wasn't about tearing down the past, it was about understanding it and building something better from it. Keller wasn't sure where he would go from here, but he knew one thing for certain. He had learned what real strength looked like, and it wasn't about loud words or viral moments. It was about the quiet confidence of someone who had earned the right to stand on their own. Keller spent the next few days in reflection, replaying the events over and over in his mind. He had been so focused on tearing Eastwood down, on making his name in the process, that he hadn't realized the true cost of his arrogance. The world wasn't waiting for the next loud voice to emerge. It was waiting for someone who could truly contribute, someone who had substance behind their words. The calls for interviews, the social media buzz, they felt meaningless now. Keller didn't want to be known for that moment anymore. He wanted to be known for something real. He realized the only way forward was to start over, to build a foundation based on respect and understanding, not sensationalism. And so, with a new sense of purpose, Keller began to shift his focus. No more easy jabs at people for the sake of clicks. It was time to do the hard work, to find his own voice, not as a critic, but as someone with something worth saying. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was one he was finally ready to face. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more content that challenges the status quo, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Stay tuned for more thought-provoking stories, unexpected moments, and lessons that stay with you long after the video ends. Subscribe to Tailcraft now.